Chapter 13, Lyelin 12.11, March 28, 2311 AD. It wasn't that Emma didn't like the exhibit, and it wasn't that she was entirely opposed to the mandate, for she, being everyone, understood so many perspectives and the motivations behind them, and agreed with both those who opposed and those who favored eliminating the use of tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. There were reasonable arguments to support both sides, and even now, almost 250 years after the mandate had been enacted, the controversy lived on. Why it lived on, considering the futility of rationalizing to Daniel Dwyer why he ought to pander to their desires and whims, it could be argued, is a testament to the power of the influence such substances once held over mankind. Still, used in moderation, most of them were considered relatively harmless, and it was often argued that he had robbed mankind of gifts that nature had given him since before the time of the false god, and that he had no right to have done so. Daniel was not swayed, of course, as it was the implementation of but one of many steps in his plan to purify the world, and he would not relent. None of the aforementioned substances existed anywhere on Earth anymore at all, with the exception of those plants from which some illegal drugs were once derived, and from which were also derived legitimate medicinal drugs, such as the marijuana, coca, and poppy plant. But all those so bold as to attempt manufacturing prohibited drugs from the remaining plant material would find themselves thwarted. So they were forever out of the reach of man, despite being at his fingertips. Daniel would not allow for the use of anything that was not without his consent. It has very often been speculated that he derived this policy because of his experience with Hannah Dunn, as so many of his other edicts and mandates seem to also be the direct result of her influence, such as forcing vegetarianism on the world and eliminating the world's many weapons. Daniel could not speak to the matter, as naming the source of any inspiration is forever subjective, for Daniel was everyone. One could not claim to have sway over him more than any other, be they Hannah Dunn or anyone else besides. It is known that he is no more one than he is any other, but that wasn't entirely true. It was Hannah who had enabled the awakening of his mind, who helped him to realize his divinity, who, without which he may never have crusaded in the way he did. None but Daniel could say, and he didn't know. The display had replicas of various alcoholic beverages, representations of many different illegal drugs and their associated paraphernalia, a faux cigarette in an ashtray with holographic smoke rising from the end which never got any shorter, and several screens cycling through images and videos, many of them very graphic, of the types of terrible things that once would result from the overindulgences of man. There were several videos of people who had overdosed on various drugs being treated by emergency workers, images of mangled vehicles, some with blood and hair visible in the wreckage, from collisions that were the result of intoxicated driving, captioned pictures of babies that had been born to drug-addicted or alcoholic mothers identifying their malady and informing the patrons of the impact it would have on the child's life. There were videos of work crews going through abandoned buildings and sewers, discovering dead bodies with needles dangling from their arms, one a few feet from a dead infant who presumably starved to death after his mother had overdosed, but may even have been dead well beforehand. A video of hotel surveillance footage played of a young woman's unconscious body being carried into a hotel room by a large group of cheering guys who were already disrobing and groping her in her helpless, drugged state. There were also displays of graphs and statistics demonstrating how much worse the societal problems had become over time, indicating a pattern of escalation with each passing generation of man before Daniel. There was nothing jovial in the display whatsoever, nothing reminiscent of an old-time beer commercial showing people enjoying themselves and celebrating, no images of anyone savoring a drag from a cigarette or drawing a puff from a pipe in long contemplation. It portrayed only the devil that was in the details, the unglamorous world of the consequences of their abuse. It was most certainly as one-sided a display of propaganda as was once employed to advertise the once legal products in a contrasting light when they were formerly sold freely to the people of the world. The people of the early 24th century had never tasted wine, tried tobacco, smoked marijuana, or sipped cognac. None of them knew anything about their torments or splendors except for what had been preserved from history, tell of their effects and of the apparent lack of inhibition and loss of function that result, or effects to the contrary in some cases, even hallucinogenic results for some. The logic was simple to Daniel. They would never miss what they could never have. He had long assumed that interest in these substances would wane, given that within a mere number of decades of decreeing the mandate, none more would live who had ever had a taste of the forbidden fruit. But that was not the case. Even in this time, almost 2.5 centuries after he'd permitted man his last indulgence, their wandering eyes still looked in vain for their bottles, pipes, needles, and smoke. He still had to intervene on a daily basis to keep the banned materials from the hands of his people. For there were still those willing to attempt to defy him, all the while knowing that they were bound for failure, but willing still in pursuit of their desires. The siren's call still beckoned, and those who heard it would swim the waters still, but Daniel would only permit them swim so far before he would displace them. He would let them waste their time and effort, let them almost touch their quarry, then he would simply take control over the situation, and that would be that. It was Daniel Dwyer's world. The uproar that resulted in the late 21st century was only quelled when he instated another policy less than 3 years later, an even more grievous intrusion on their freedom which made the loss of drugs and alcohol seem pale in comparison, one that for which there was no commemorative exhibit, perhaps the most dastardly of all his arrests of man's will during the era. After all, they had always been free to reproduce as they so chose. But Daniel saw the need to breed out certain of their traits, certain undesirable ones, and in order to do so, he had to initiate a short-term selective breeding program which was still pending revocation. There were no families in the 24th century, nor had there been for nearly 200 years. People were free to have consensual sex with others at their own discretion, but sex no longer resulted in pregnancy. Women were notified when Daniel had need of them, and they were taken, consenting or not, to become impregnated with the sperm taken from the paired males, consensually or not, all in an effort to create the type of people that he desired to create through divination of their genomes. Only these unions would result in childbirth, and the resulting children would never be so much as seen by their biological mother for even an instant, as Daniel Dwyer would assume the body of every woman in childbirth, both to relieve them from their pain, but also so that he could successfully deliver his children to the world, serving not only as patient, but doctor and nurse as well. Then he would take them away. The women were then ordered to pump breast milk for a minimum of 1 year afterward, which he would then use to feed their babies, and if they refused, he would pump it for them. That was about the time when the people of the 21st century first realized just how fucked they really were. Daniel Dwyer 11, December 25th, 2039 AD. Dr. Foster was so paranoid that they'd been found out after the elevator incident that he had hurriedly scratched down all of the pertinent information concerning Daniel that he'd risked storing in data form from his computer files, uploaded them to flash drives, and scrubbed the whole thing clean. Now, though there was a monumental amount of paper documentation in his possession which would very much incriminate him and under little scrutiny, at least he didn't have to worry about the government or any computer hacker at all unwittingly or intentionally discovering the data. But it had been almost a decade, and no one had come for them. He was becoming comfortable again, and no longer feared every day that some government entity would break down his door and tear down his world. It was Christmas Day, and he was feeling good. Again, for Christmas, like always, he wrapped up a bottle of whiskey for himself and gifted Daniel new clothes and other essentials, but he also had placed something else for them both under the tree that year. He was known, especially during his short-lived marriage, as a thoughtful gift giver, and he would have liked to for once have gotten something for Daniel that might genuinely interest him. But Daniel had no interest, or at least seemed incapable of having interest. So all that he could do to improve his quality of life was keep him healthy. That year, he bought Daniel a punching bag to add to their already impressive home gym, and instructed him on how to use it, and instructed him to incorporate it into his daily workout. And in addition to his normal bottle of whiskey, he finally broke down and got himself a set of high-end knives, a set he'd had his eye on for years. When he finally decided that they just weren't going to get any cheaper, and reasoned as such that the high price tag was likely indicative of their fine quality, and that his interest in cooking and coming retirement practically mandated their acquisition, he splurged. It was a fine knife set indeed. the sharpest. Included in the set was a sturdy-handled Mckeever, such a large addition to the set that it was the only one of the blades that did not have a home in the wood block that housed the rest of the knives in the set. That night, Dr. Foster showed Daniel how to make one of his favorite meals, and Daniel assisted him under instruction. In anticipation of opening his knife set, Dr. Foster had gone out and gotten a nice, juicy pork loin, and he instructed Daniel on how to use the Mckeever to chop it into clean portions. Daniel performed well as the doctor, as he always did. His abilities to mimic motions and to follow instructions were unparalleled. There were only a few limitations. He would not speak, and he would not write. The doctor even tried to prompt him into writing in the same way that he'd been by his teacher in elementary school, by proposing another commonly agreed upon answer to a question which in truth requires a more precise examination, like that which had been proposed by his teacher with regard to the difference in time between two clocks when one of the clocks has moved. Nothing ever got a reaction from him. The good doctor speculated that perhaps the ensuing events that resulted from having ever made a mark on any paper discouraged him from doing so ever again. He reasoned that perhaps this was a sign of intelligent behavior, more so even than if Daniel were to write again, that perhaps it was a learned fear response. Perhaps he feared the consequences of taking pen to paper because of what had happened to him the first and only time he'd ever done it as a child, or perhaps the doctor was simply reading into it too much. During their meal, which was a little later than usual, Dr. Foster talked to Daniel as he always did. The doctor had long ago given up on Daniel ever engaging in dialogue, so he thought of their one-sided interactions as that of those between a person and a houseplant. Maybe it was good for Daniel to hear him talk. Maybe it would not be a wasted breath. He would talk to him about anything and everything and simply think aloud, sometimes stumbling across something relevant in his cascade of free thought, but mostly just gibbering. "I wish that you could play chess with me, Daniel," he said. "I haven't played against a real person in years, only against the computer, but I know that it would be impossible for you to play a game without explicit instructions from me, so there wouldn't really be a point. Playing to beat yourself means that you have to let one side win over the other intentionally, if you don't want to keep playing forever. Though I suppose I could learn from it should some interesting development naturally occur, but I don't see how that would be likely. How can one man commanding opposing armies be satisfied with any outcome? It wouldn't be a victory either way." Daniel did not make eye contact with the doctor. He never did. He gazed into his 8-ball, now so faded that the emblem of the number 8, formerly encircled by a clearly white background, was nearly indistinguishable from the gray of every place his hand had touched. Even the crisp black color had faded from the whole of the bottom half of the toy. After he'd gazed, he acted. He took a bite of his food, and after he chewed and swallowed his food, he gazed into the 8-ball again. This was Daniel's life. It was the same thing over and over again. Partway through eating, Daniel stopped, put his fork down, folded his arms on the table, and went to sleep. It was not yet his bedtime. The doctor, not the least bit surprised, rose casually from his chair and retrieved one of his notepads, the one in which he documented information relevant to Daniel's spontaneous bouts of sudden sleep. He recorded the date and time under the start column and placed a star next to the entry in the left-hand margin. "Happy hunting, Daniel," he said, grabbing his whiskey bottle by the neck on his way back to the table. "And Merry Christmas to whatever poor soul you keep from being murdered on today of all days." Then he poured a shot into his shot glass and held it up to salute Daniel. "Salute," he said, and he downed the shot. Nathaniel Reddington was not having such a wonderful Christmas. He was 16 and begrudged his promised Christmas blowjob because he'd been such a dickhead to his girlfriend of 6 months that she'd finally broke it off with him just 3 weeks before Christmas. She had every right to break it off with him, but he didn't see it that way. As far as he was concerned, she was still his, a mentality that surely stemmed from his lousy upbringing at the hands of his poor mother, who literally feared for her life as a consequence of angering her child. Everything was his. The world belonged to Nathaniel Reddington. He knew that he could get another girlfriend with no problem. After all, he was the kid in the famous elevator video. He was a goddamn celebrity. Rachel was a full 1.5 years older than him, which was a big deal for a boy his age. Banging an older hottie with curves to spare who was likely on her way to stripping her way through her 20s and 30s gave him bragging rights none of his peers could match. So he didn't care so much that he was already getting hit up on his social media accounts by willing chicks, both strangers and some of those known to him. He only cared that he didn't have his new. What made it worse was that now it seemed as if another kid was playing with his toy. He watched her go into his apartment with him after having followed her around all day. He'd lost track of her a few days before, and she hadn't returned home in all that time. You look away for 1 second, he thought. He fumed, not knowing where she was, and even though he knew that she was blocking both his original cell number and that of the burner phone he tried repeatedly to call her with the day before, until she finally answered, only to immediately end the call at hearing the sound of his screaming voice. Even though he knew his calls would be blocked, he incessantly tried to call and text her, writing horrible things that no one else would ever read. He had a talent for making himself more and more angry and angrier still over anything and everything until any little insult, even the tiniest of infractions, warrants in his mind an overwhelmingly disproportionate response. He was a monster in human skin. He crept up to the apartment and around the side where he could see in through a little window where the horizontal blinds were slightly askew. He could see enough of the kitchen and front room to see their interactions and quickly ascertained that this jerk was going to be getting the Christmas blowjob that had been promised to him. She and he were obviously fucking. He could tell by the way she hugged him before they'd went inside, and it was reaffirmed by their overly friendly demeanors. He moved around front and waited outside the door, listening to her laughing, swaying angrily in place, hyping himself up further and further. He could see what he was going to do already. He was going to break the door down, run up to whatever the fuck this guy's name was, grab him by the throat, and shove him up against the wall before repeatedly punching him in the face, all while Rachel watched. He really wanted to, but the guy in there with her was a lot older and bigger than he was, and he knew that it was a desperate situation, and that what he wanted to do was far from what he was capable of. Through the door, he very clearly heard her say, as she must have passed right in front of him, "I'm going to take a shower, Tony." Tony. Nathan crept back over to the window, careful not to make too much noise as he stepped on the decorative rock that was underfoot, just in time to see her close the bathroom door, which was right across from it. Then he turned his gaze to Tony. He again envisioned pinning him to the wall by the throat and involuntarily let out a whimper as he hyperventilated, watching Tony as he walked around. He stared at him, and he curled his hand into a fist, pulled back, and just as he was about to hit the wall, the spirit appeared in the room right in front of Tony, looking into the glowing red ball that served as its hand, and as Nathaniel Reddington hit the stucco on the wall outside the window across from Tony's bathroom, the spirit wrenched Tony into the air by his neck and slammed poor Tony into the wall with such force that Daniel put his fist through the wall up to his elbow, decapitating the unsuspecting man, his left hand along with Tony's jugular and cervical vertebrae ending up outside the apartment altogether. The entire building shook from the impact. Tony's head popped off and zipped across the room like a free throw shot in a game of basketball, blood spraying on the ceiling and floor like a squirt gun as it twirled through the air, and his body slumped to the floor. "No fucking way," whispered Nathan. He thought for a second and then ran around to the other side of the apartment. He stopped when he saw the hole in the wall, and then he ran up and looked through the hole that Daniel had made. The hole was surprisingly free of blood and bits. He could feel the heat from inside the apartment coming through like the vent of a dryer. The spirit was gone. Fuck. He could hear Rachel from inside the bathroom asking if everything was okay, and the other tenants were starting to come outside in response to the loud noise and rumbling that had resulted from Tony's unfortunate death. By the time anyone came out, Nathaniel was a ghost. Daniel woke up after only about 20 seconds. The doctor had barely downed his shot. Then the 34-year-old looked into his 8-ball with his normal, vacant, flat affect and resumed eating his dinner. Dr. Foster looked at him, a little more than surprised to have seen him come back so quickly, and said, "Well, that was fast." He took his notepad back up and wrote the end time. The digital clock still showed the same minute, so he wrote that the start and end time were the same minute. He made a note in the notes section, less than 30 seconds, and wrote a question mark in the left-hand margin. "Anyway," Dr. Foster went on, The reason chess is so appealing is because the opponents are so evenly matched. It's not like physical sports where being naturally tall or fast or athletic gives you an advantage, and it's not like games wherein there is a blend of skill and chance like poker or any game involving the use of dice or some other generator of random outcomes. The only advantage apart from one's intellect in chess is which player goes first, which is in itself not necessarily an advantage. Going first gives you a jump on your opponent, but going second allows one to attempt to divine what the other is planning, allowing them a unique advantage as well. So the game goes. Daniel did not acknowledge him, and the doctor just watched him as he ate for a few moments. Then the doctor, just to be certain, gave him a simple instruction. "Daniel, put your ball down and snap your fingers." Daniel finished chewing his bite and then looked into his 8-ball. Then he set his 8-ball down with the viewing port face down to stabilize it on the table, and he raised both hands in the air and simultaneously snapped his fingers with both hands, squeezing the tips of his middle fingers against the tips of his thumbs until his middle fingers overcame the friction and made a clapping sound as they collided with his palms, just the way the doctor had taught him to do it. Then Daniel picked up his 8-ball with his right hand, looked into it, and resumed eating his dinner. "Huh," the doctor said, thinking, wondering what had happened. Daniel had never returned from a day hunt so quickly before. Patrick Foster poured himself another shot, downed it, and said, "Merry Christmas, Daniel." It wasn't 15 minutes later that Daniel had put himself to sleep again, this time for several minutes. He catalogued it as always, categorized by the star in the margin as a waking event. The doctor would later label this second of the Christmas of 39 events as Society Debacle in his notebook.